going to go back about 65 years ago when I first discovered RiNo. I was in the back of my father's pickup truck. He was a merchant. He sold sacks and boxes to the Nargo market merchants, the meat packing industry, flour mills, all of the merchants who were in the RiNo area. It was a busy area. It was an area where things were made, and it was a great experience for me, especially going to the potato chip factory and getting the potato chips right out of the kettle. But in any event, I loved the experience and the place. I'm not sure that I didn't love riding in my father's pickup more than the place. But talking about place, I'll share with you a little story of my mother and father. My mother wanted to move to a different neighborhood. My father, he had different ideas. He was happy where he was. So his rationale to my mother was, place doesn't really make the person. The person makes the place. So let's not move. So that was my kind of first hearing of a dialogue between my parents. And in terms of place and person, I heard other dialogues, but that was the first one on that. But place has always kind of resonated with me, and I've been involved with person and place for the last 40 years. And place is really powerful in terms of affecting people's behavior. But people, I guess I have to agree with my father, is probably more important. And that I realize in terms of what I've done during this period of time. It's really the people that are so important, that work with me, that basically shared things with me. And I could probably spend the rest of my time talking about that, but the fact is that there were a couple people who really had a major influence on me. One of them is my son Kyle, my partner, whose passion, whose creativity, his follow-through really was a significant part in making my career what it is. And the other is Susan Wick, my companion, my art influence, who always made me believe that art was a powerful influence. It changed reality. But let me talk a little bit more about my experience or my attitudes over the last 40 years. I guess it starts with, in a sense, with place. I think that as a developer, it's a privilege, but it's also a responsibility to put something on the built environment. It lasts for 25 years or so, if you're maybe longer. So it's a responsibility. And toward that responsibility, I believe that you have to be a long-term player. I think there's lots of things going on where people build an apartment, they sell it, they leave, and the community deals with the parking problems. But I think we're here for the long term. I've been involved in RiNo now for 15 years and probably a similar periods of time in Lodo and in the Golden Triangle. The other aspect of what we do is really trying to match people's needs with the place. And those needs are not just the obvious needs, but it's trying to anticipate what those needs might be or could be. For instance, new workplaces, new ways to eat, things that people really haven't thought about, or a whole new environment. It really begins with vision, Then it goes to commitment. From commitment, it goes to placement. And placement is community, talking about community. So let's start with vision. And vision, I think the best way to have you understand a little about vision is to take you through my experience at RiNo. Some 50 years ago, or 50 years after my first experience there, I revisited RiNo. RiNo was, at that point in time, had really deteriorated. It hadn't received any care. The city hadn't really invested in it. Businesses had abused it. And it was kind of a gritty place with junkyards, car parts, things like that, whereas before it had this vibrancy where things were made. But there was still something about this grittiness that was a challenge, the opportunity to change things. And the empty buildings were an opportunity, and being a developer, low, cheap land prices was another opportunity. And there was an abundance of land and buildings. So it also had some major positives. It was close to downtown. It had easy access to the freeways. It had the Platte River, which was not exactly pure, but it was Denver's river. And it was that kind of opportunity and the feeling of history and art. There were lots of artists in this area. So that kind of swayed me toward maybe I should consider this as a place of development. It wasn't very logical, but I took Susan over, and the first thing we did was buy a 1901 building that we planned to and have as our house and studio. From there, I went and looked for a site for a building. Looked at Taxi, which was a 30,000 square foot building with about 6 acres of ground. And for all practical purposes, it was a throwaway. It was surrounded on one side by the RTD maintenance facility, the other side by a concrete company. The backside had 23 tracks on it. And of course, we had the beautiful Platte River in front of us, but you couldn't cross it. But it did have great views. And the concept that I came up with was, let's turn it into a new workplace. People at that point were pretty much working out of cubicles. And that wasn't a very interesting place. There was no collaboration, no movement. And this building, notwithstanding its deteriorated condition, had broken skylights, and the cabs used to run up and down the roadways. This was basically a place where repairs were made. So we took those roadways, and they just became not hallways, but interior streets where people could meet and talk. And that was the whole idea of creating a place that's accessible, where people talk, where it was open. And with the outside landscape, they were able to really come up with trees or WeWar and be able to communicate outside. That was the process of placement. But in terms of placement, that's a continuing process that we have to make sure that it's always changing. So with the placement, that's the architecture, the design, the elements that really make a place work. And it's the second phase of what we did was really Taxi 2, where we felt we had to have people. It had to be a 24-hour place. So we created the Taxi 2, where basically it was a marker on the land telling people across the river that we existed. and it housed 50 units and created this people interaction. And we took this placement process and really took it farther. We went across the river. We created the source at Taxi. We created early childhood center, and the source became the new eating place. So there was always kind of additions on there. And we now have about 400,000 feet of building and more than 400 people working at Taxi. I think the most gratifying part was seeing how this process worked and spread across to RiNo, where the arts community and everybody else kind of worked together to create a community, and community is really the name of the thing. We work with the city, and they've committed to do new Brighton Boulevard, bike paths, improve the river, and make all these improvements. And the great part was how people really realized this grittiness. It was an opportunity. They were able to come in and do their own thing, and that really was the idea. And it's gratifying to see RiNo really take off, and so much energy between the people, the city, the arts community. The interesting part is the arts community is really the governing umbrella of the whole organization. Thank you. And by the way, my mother convinced my father to move. Thank you.